Hello everyone. Today we will discuss a mechanism of muscle contraction. Mechanism of muscle contraction. So the mechanism of muscle contraction is explained by sliding filament theory. Mechanism of muscle contraction explained by sliding filament theory. Sliding filament theory. So the mechanism of muscle contraction was explained by sliding filament theory. So it is proposed by the scientist. It is proposed by Jane Hansen and Hugh Huxley. Jane Hansen and Hugh Huxley. So it is proposed by the Jane Hansen and Hugh Huxley. So the mechanism of muscle contraction is explained by the sliding filament theory. Mechanism of muscle contraction explained by the sliding filament theory. So it is proposed by the two scientists. One is the Jane Hansen, another one is the Hugh Huxley. Jane Hansen and Hugh Huxley. So the mechanism of muscle contraction followed by the steps. Mechanism of muscle contraction. Mechanism of muscle contraction present few steps. First one excitation of muscle. First one excitation of muscle. So the muscle contraction initiated by central nervous system. Muscle contraction is initiated by central nervous system. Send motor neurons. The central nervous system send the motor neurons to neuromuscular junction. Neuromuscular junction. First of all, the muscle contraction initiated by the central nervous system. The central nervous system means brain and spinal cord. So the brain sending the motor neurons. The motor neurons reaching the neuromuscular junction. For example, so these are the muscle. So these are the central nervous system. So the central nervous system sending the motor neurons, sending through the motor neurons. So the impulse reaching the neuromuscular junction. So the neuromuscular junction means, for example, so they are the cell body. So these are the dendrites. So these are the axon. So the axon contain axon filaments. So they are the telodendri. So these telodendri connecting from the muscle fiber. So in this region is called as neuromuscular junction. Neuromuscular junction. Understand? So the neuron contain a cell body, dendrites, axon. So the one neuron axon contain a terminal filament. So telodendrite. So the telodendrite connecting from the muscle fibers. So in this region is called as neuromuscular junction. So the neuromuscular junction, the releasing from the neuromuscular junction releasing from the acetylcholine. So releasing from the neuromuscular junction releasing from the acetylcholine from the plasma lemma. So the neuromuscular junction they releasing from the acetylcholine. So the acetylcholine from the plasma lemma. So the acetylcholine they releasing from the axon, plasma lemma releasing from the action potential. Action potentials. So the action potential. So the neuromuscular junction the ending of the neurons they releasing from the acetylcholine. They are the acetylcholine they releasing of the action potential. So the action potential sending from the action potentials reach the cisternae, reach from the T-tubule to send to the cisternae of sarcoplasmic reticulum. The impulse sending to the sarcoplasmic T-tubule to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So they are the muscle. So they are the first one muscle contain a triad system. Or triad system means, so these are the one T-tubule. So the T-tubule either side. So they are the either side contain a cisternae. So they are the cisternae. So the cisternae contain a calcium ions. So the impulse reaching from the cisternae of the triad system. The action potential reaching from the cisternae of the triad system. Triad system means one T-tubule either side of the cisternae. So they are the three. So they are called as triad system. So the electrical impulse, the action potential reaching from the cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum release calcium ions. Sarcoplasmic reticulum release calcium ions. So these are the excitation of muscle. First of all, excitation of muscle means first step. So the central nervous system, the initiation of the muscle contraction, the central nervous system, motor neurons are the sending from the motor impulse from the central nervous system. These central nervous system impulse are reaching from the neuromuscular junction. So in this neuromuscular junction releasing from the acetylcholine. So the acetylcholine is the action potentials. So the action potential means impulse, muscle contraction impulse. So these impulse are reaching to the plasma lemma of the muscle. So the impulse reaching from the plasma lemma. So these are the plasma lemma. So the impulse reaching from the plasma lemma. So the impulse reaching from the plasma lemma to triad system. Plasma lemma to triad system. Triad system contain a T-tubule. Triad system contain a T-tubule. The T-tubule, the impulse sending from the sarcoplasm. Sending from the, so these are the sarcoplasm. Impulse sending from the sarcoplasm through the cisternae. Through the cisternae. So these impulses reaching from the triad system, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, storehouse of the calcium ions. Sarcoplasmic reticulum, storehouse of the calcium ions. So the impulse receiving from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, so they are releasing from the calcium ions. They are releasing from the calcium ions. They are releasing from the calcium ions. So these are called as excitation of muscle. Excitation of muscle. Simple. First one, central nervous system releasing from the acetylcholine. The acetylcholine, they produce of the action potentials. The action potential reaching to the plasma lemma of the muscle. So the action potential plasma lemma to enter into the triad system. So this triad system contain a T-tubule and two cisternae, either side of the cisternae. The impulse, the action potential from the plasma lemma to through the T-tubule sending from the total muscle. So the impulse reaching from the cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum releasing calcium ions. Releasing calcium ions. So these are the excitation of muscle. So they are the excitation of muscle. Next one, second one, formation of cross bridge. Second one, formation of cross bridge. Second one, formation of cross bridge. Formation of cross bridge. Formation of cross bridge. Second side heading, formation of cross bridge. So the formation of cross bridge, first of all, so the increasing calcium ion levels. Increasing calcium ions, increasing calcium ions levels. The calcium ions binding, the calcium ions binding troponin C, C of the troponin, C of the troponin protein. Troponin. So the first step, increasing calcium ions. So the excitation of muscle, in this process, final step, they are releasing of the calcium ions. So the increasing of calcium ion levels, the calcium ions binding to the troponin C of the troponin protein. The troponin protein contain 3 subunits: troponin T, troponin I and troponin C. So the calcium ions binding to troponin C. Calcium ions binding to the troponin C. So the diagram, so these are the thin filament. So they are the actin. So the actin, they contain a, so these are the tropomyosin. They are the tropomyosin. Next one, another one is the troponin. Troponin contain a 3 subunits: 1, 2 and 3. So they are the troponin T, troponin C, troponin I. So the in this thin filament, so they are the thin filament. So the calcium ions are the increasing, levels are the increasing from the calcium ions. The calcium ions binding from the troponin C. So the troponin C binding the calcium ions. The troponin C binding the calcium ions. So the troponin C binding to the calcium ions, the troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin and tropomyosin unmasking of troponin tropomyosin, change in position of actin filaments. Troponin and tropomyosin change in position, so they are the turning from the one side. So the troponin C binding of the calcium ions, so the troponin and tropomyosin change in the position of the actin filament, so the expose actin site of expose myosin binding site. Expose myosin binding site of actin filament. So the exposing of the myosin binding of actin filament. So the change in the position of the troponin and tropomyosin, so the expose of the myosin binding site. So this actin filament contain a myosin binding site. So the change in the position, so the exposing of the myosin binding site. So the myosin utilize of ATP energy. The myosin utilize of ATP energy. The myosin head attached to the myosin binding site of actin filament. So the finally formation of cross bridge, release of PI, so they are the formation of cross bridge. Once revise formation of cross bridge. So the first step, excitation of muscle. In the excitation of muscle, in the last step, the muscle cisterness releasing of the calcium ions. So the increasing of the calcium levels of the sarcoplasm. So these are the effectin filaments. So these contain a tropomyosin. So these are the tropomyosin. So in this tropomyosin, in this filament also contain another protein, troponin. The troponin contain 3 subproteins. One is the troponin I, another one is the troponin C, another one is the troponin T. So they totally thin filament. So they are the totally thin filament. So in this thin filament, the increasing of the calcium ion levels, so the calcium ions binding of the troponin C, calcium ions binding with the troponin C, So in this calcium ions binding time, troponin and tropomyosin change in position. troponin and tropomyosin change in position of the actin filaments. So the actin filaments expose myosin binding site of actin filaments. The actin filament exposing of the myosin binding site, For example, so these are the exposing myosin binding site, So the exposing myosin binding site, so they are the myosin. So the myosin head binding. So the myosin head is binding. So they are the myosin. So these myosin head, they contain a ATP binding site and myosin binding site. So the ATP they releasing from the energy. That energy utilization, the head is binding to the myosin by actin binding site. So the myosin head binding to the actin. So these are called formation of cross bridge. These are called as formation of cross bridge. So they are called as formation of cross bridge. So they are the two steps is completed. First one, excitation of muscle. So the excitation of muscle, the final step, they releasing of the calcium ions. Next step, formation of cross bridge. In the formation of cross bridge, so the calcium ions are the increases. The calcium ion binding to the troponin C of the troponin. So they are the actin filament. So the calcium ions binding to the troponin C. So the troponin and tropomyosin change in the position. Troponin and tropomyosin change in the position. So the exposing of the myosin binding site. So the myosin head utilization of the ATP energy. The myosin head binding to the actin filament. So these are called as formation of cross bridge. Finally releasing of the PI. So the final releasing of the PI. Next, third one is the power stroke. Next class we will discuss power stroke.